So Prime Minister Narendra Modi has arrived in Nigeria for the first leg of his three-nation tour that's going to happen over the next 5 days. We're here, of course, at India Today Global to always explain to you what the Prime Minister is doing in these foreign countries, why exactly he's traveling abroad, what the importance of these countries are in India's foreign policy. So we have coming up now, just like always, another explainer on this three-nation visit the Prime Minister is starting on from the 16th to the 21st of November. He's starting off with Nigeria. He then flies off to Brazil for the G20, and then he goes to another very, very important country for India in Latin America, which is Guyana. So let's get into it. Let's talk about what the Prime Minister is doing. He's left and arrived in Nigeria just a little while ago, and he has, of course, met with, he's been received by Nigerian dignitaries and will be meeting with Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who is the president of Nigeria. Now, Nigeria is an important nation. It has a population of well over 200 million people. It is one of Africa's most important nations. Going back in history, it was one of the first nations that India built a strong strategic relationship with in Africa, going back 50, 60, 70 years during the time of Jawaharlal Nehru. So absolutely a very, very important country within West Africa, extremely diverse nation, but extremely powerful as well in the context of the regional geopolitics of Africa. It also has a strong relationship with India. India has around 60,000 strong Indian diaspora that lives in Nigeria. It is, if I remember my facts right, it is the largest Indian diaspora that exists in West Africa, which is the part of Africa that Nigeria is in. There is a bilateral trade of around $15 billion, an emerging relationship that has existed for some time in oil and energy, which is another major export that the Nigerians have that they sell into the world. India also has major defense cooperation with Nigeria. India helped establish the National Defense Academy as well as the National War College in Nigeria. So there's an old defense relationship there as well. And Nigeria is really part of an emerging strategy that in Indian foreign policy, where it is trying to place more of a spotlight on parts of the world that it has traditionally in its foreign policy not focused on as strongly as it should have. Latin America is one example, which is we'll get to with the Prime Minister's second half of his second and third legs of his visit. But Africa is another one of those parts of the world. India has around $100 billion in trade with major African nations. You will remember that India also hosted William Ruto, the Prime Minister of Kenya, some while back. Tanzania, of course, we've hosted the president of Tanzania a while back, and with both those countries, we're doing more on cooperation on defense, on economic cooperation, and so on and so forth. Nigeria, of course, another major regional power, major African power. We're trying to build relations with Nigeria as well. So it really shows that there is some focus on getting African nations on board with India's agenda, whether it comes to greater economic cooperation, whether it comes to cooperation on clean energy, when it comes to cooperation on digital technologies. India has, of course, its India Stack when you talk about Aadhaar, as well as UPI, and a stack and host of other government services that are known as digital public infrastructure. That is something that India is pushing very, very strongly to a number of African nations. Nigeria, of course, is absolutely one among them. So it's a very, very crucial relationship. And throughout the course of today, you're going to see a series of meetings right now with the delegation level talks with the Indian delegation as well as with the Nigerian delegation, should be headed by Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who is the president of Nigeria. You have in the course of this visit, you're going to have some major MOUs being signed in areas like culture, traditional medicine, also economic cooperation. That is something that we're going to see. But really, the visit needs to be understood in the context of what India is trying to do more broadly. When of course William Ruto, the Prime Minister of Kenya, had come, there was a conversation about a Indo-Pacific a cooperation on. There was a vision statement that was released when the leader of Kenya was here, and that focused more on East Africa and naval cooperation and a joint maritime vision between India and Kenya. With Tanzania, we focused a lot on building up defense as well as helping them meet some of their defense needs in a way that, for example, a country like China usually does, but we are stepping in that particular relationship. So Nigeria needs to be seen in the context of that outreach to African nations. Also, we've heard some inklings of the fact that there will be the next iteration of the India-Africa summit which the last one happened in 2015 when you had dozens of African leaders descend on New Delhi, come here for a major multilateral meeting. Of course, India with a number of African leaders. That was a major occasion in 2015. Of course, through the years, there has been a conversation about having a second iteration of that. It has not happened so far. Scheduling errors, the COVID-19 pandemic, so on. But now you're going to have, according to the Ministry of External Affairs, some conversation about having the India-Africa Summit in early 2025. So within a couple of months, that's the expectation. And that's the hope. So again, as I was saying, Nigeria needs to be understood in the context of the broader relationship that India has with a number of African countries. So that's Nigeria talked about, which is oil and energy, which is economics, which is about the Indian diaspora, which is about defense. That is something that India will be looking to expand in one of Africa's most important countries, after which the Prime Minister will be heading off to the second leg of his visit, which is to Brazil. And this is, of course, he's going to Rio de Janeiro, where he's going to attend the G20 summit. It's been a full year, I know, since India hosted the G20 summit in New Delhi in September last year. Now, of course, Brazil is hosting it. It's a rotating presidency, and of course, India has extended support to it. In the G20 generally functions with the system of a troika, which is that the country that holds is, of course, holding the presidency of the G20 that year, which is assisted by the country that held it in the previous year, which is India, and the country which is going to hold it in the next year, which is South Africa. So India, South Africa, and Brazil have formed the troika that is pushing the G20 agenda forward. Before that, of course, Indonesia held the presidency of the G20. So you've had 4 developing nations hold the presidency of the G20, which is somewhat unprecedented in the organization's history. So India has, of course, pushed on some of the major priorities that it sees as flowing from the G20 summit, which is, of course, food security, which is a better economic deal for developing nations. There's going to be a global alliance against hunger and poverty that is going to be revealed at this summit in Rio, and that is something that India is going to back. India is going to join several pillars of this initiative. So G20 generally tends to push the initiatives of the previous presidency forward, so that there can be more conversation on these key issues. And of course, this is something that's happening on the backdrop of this massive problem that we've had in developing nations over the last couple of years, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. There are a number of developing nations that are actually slipping back in terms of their sustainable development goals, in terms of meeting requirements for there's increasing indebtedness in the governments of a lot of these developing nations across the world that are increasingly unable to meet their obligations to their people in terms of ensuring better healthcare, better education, better social development indicators. In fact, they're slipping in many key respects, and that is a matter of great worry. India has talked about it a great deal, which is why so much of its focus of its G20 presidency was actually on the global south, because these countries have had a really, really difficult time. And so the focus on the global alliance against hunger and poverty, which you will see in this coming G20, is also flowing from that concern from developing nations that, in fact, since the COVID-19 pandemic, you have had this absolute evisceration of economic growth, inflation, rise of the rise of inflation, the rise of much greater difficulties in terms of providing for social healthcare, social services, healthcare, education, so on. So really, many developing nations are having a very, very difficult time, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. They urgently need finance. They urgently need economic monetary support. They need reforms as well, and that is something that India pushed during its presidency, which is why it also pushed for having the African Union join the G20, so that more African concerns could be highlighted. This is something now that we're going to see in the Brazilian presidency as well, and something you will see in next year as well, because South Africa is going to take over the presidency of the G20 after that. So that is what's happening in Rio, and that's what the Prime Minister Narendra Modi is going to go to Rio to attend the G20 Leaders Summit. After that, he moves on to Guyana. Guyana is, again, a country that Indians don't hear about too much, but really it is a country that has a very deep historic relationship with India. Remember that it's a small country, of course, in Latin America, but there is a historic relationship, given the fact that really so much of the population is actually of Indian origin. These were taken centuries ago. These people who centuries ago migrated to Guyana, were taken to Guyana and worked there, established communities there, and that has become a major, major part of India's outreach to Guyana. That's why so many prominent politicians in Guyana have been coming to India very recently. Of course, the vice president of Guyana is Bharat Jagdev, who is who's of course of Indian origin himself. Irfan Ali is currently the president, and he is someone who has come to India several times. He's also met with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It's a relationship that is extremely important because and Guyana may have popped up on your radar because of the discovery of large amounts of oil reserves that have been found in just the last couple of years in Guyana. It has made Guyana really one of the world's newest oil powers. That is considered very, very important. It is likely to, in fact, in many ways, transform the economic and social fortunes of Guyana. It could become an extremely rich country, and they want India to help develop its natural gas industries and so on and so forth. In fact, I have had the pleasure of interviewing the Vice President of Guyana back in 2023 when he was here for a meeting with the Indian government, and he very clearly said that he would like to see more cooperation on the field of energy and natural gas with India. So that is a relationship that has been going on for a while, and India is very keen to help Guyana develop its natural gas resources, because you would recall that India has a close relationship with Guyana. There's a historic relationship there, there's a demographic relationship there, and India, of course, has companies that go out into the world like ONGC Videsh that could help Guyana with much of the needs that it has. So India wants to diversify its sources of oil imports. Remember, we get much of our oil from the Middle East, from Russia. India wants to diversify it to protect itself from geopolitical shocks, and therefore Guyana's emergence as an energy power is a big economic opportunity for India. So Guyana asking for Indian investment in the oil sector as well as skilled engineering. Guyana also wants India to do more on defense. In fact, I've also had the opportunity to sit down and chat with the then National Security Advisor of Guyana, who sort of talked to me about what Guyana is hoping from India in terms of increased cooperation on defense, increased cooperation on training, increased cooperation on equipment. Of course, Guyana has purchased aircraft from India under lines of credit in the past. That is a relationship that has been going on for some time, and there is every expectation that that relationship will expand. So India is also in some ways a defense partner for Guyana, and that's an important relationship that India would like to see develop. But really the key play here that I would like you to understand is the oil and the energy play. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi going there to meet Irfan Ali, the Prime Minister of Guyana, who is also looking for more investment from Indian companies into Guyana. That's important. Prime Minister Modi will also be going there for the CARICOM India Summit, which is of course India's forum summit with Caribbean leaders, and that's something that again you will see a lot of focus on. You see a lot of Indian ministers of state for external affairs, as well as External Affairs Minister Jaishankar also sort of get a lot of face time with leaders from this part of the world, because India wants to sort of develop its relationships with these countries that have been, again, like I said, previously fairly neglected in India's foreign policy, but as India's reach grows, it wants to develop its relationship with these parts of the world. So CARICOM countries is something that India will be focusing on, and that is what India and Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be looking to push for. So that is the three-nation visit that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is embarking on, starting in Nigeria, moving on to Brazil, and then he will head off to Guyana for this important set of meetings on the oil and natural gas sector, as well as on defense. So those were the three. That was our basic explanation of what the Prime Minister is out to achieve in these three countries. We hope that was useful to you. We will keep you absolutely updated on what the Prime Minister is up to. A series of meetings today, like I was saying, expected between Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, the President of Nigeria. It's not going to be a very long sojourn in Nigeria, so he heads off then to Brazil, but we will keep you absolutely updated with the latest on his evolving visit until the 21st of November. Thank you so much for watching us on India Today Global.